In 1976, the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences was awarded to Milton Friedman. The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences praised him for his achievements in the fields of consumption analysis, monetary history and theory, and for his demonstration of the complexity of stabilization policy. The decision to choose Friedman could not have been more timely. The world was reeling from economic chaos. High inflation, low growth, oil shocks, and something economists once thought impossible: stagflation. The old Keynesian models couldn't explain what was going on. Governments had been spending big, trying to stimulate demand, reduce unemployment, and push economies out of recession. But instead of booms, they got inflation. The dream of the government managing the economy like a well-oiled machine was over. Milton Friedman said he had the answer. It was radically different from the consensus, and his ideas have transformed the world. But now, almost 50 years later, what is Friedman's legacy? The 1970s were a turning point in economic history, and Friedman's ideas represented an intellectual revolution when compared to the post-war consensus. His Nobel Prize in 1976 came before his policies were widely implemented. But the tide was already turning. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan would soon bring Friedman's ideas to life, cutting taxes, deregulating markets, and targeting money supply in the fight against inflation. Friedman believed in free markets, in small government, in minimal interference, and he loathed the idea that a group of government bureaucrats could fine-tune an entire economy. These things, he believed, were better left to the market. So what did he actually win the Nobel for? Well, let's go through it, step by step. He began by challenging how we think about consumption. Back in the Keynesian era, the idea was simple. If people had more money today, they'd spend more. If they had less, they'd spend less. So governments could boost consumption and the economy by simply pumping money into people's pockets. Friedman disagreed. He introduced something called the permanent income hypothesis. The idea is simple. People don't base their spending on what they earn today. They base it on what they expect to earn over the long run. In other words, consumption is stable. It doesn't bounce around wildly with every paycheck or tax rebate. This was important because it meant government stabilization policies would be largely ineffective. It meant that short-term stimulus might not actually boost demand much. People might just save it, or use it to pay off debts. With monetary theory, Friedman took a basic equation from economics, MV equals PQ, where M is the money supply. V is the velocity of money. That is how quickly it changes hands and goes round the economy. P is the price level and represents inflation. And Q is real output, the same as goods and services. This equation is more correctly called an identity. It's like saying speed equals distance over time. It's not controversial. It is always true. It is probably universally accepted. But Friedman took it further with his assumptions. He said, assume V and Q are stable, or at least predictable. That changes things. Given these assumptions, if you increase M, the money supply, then P, the price level, has to rise. There is no alternative. And that is inflation. By tweaking the assumptions, Friedman dismantled the whole Keynesian idea that rising costs or rising demand caused inflation. He dismantled the idea that greedy unions or rising oil prices were the main drivers of price increases. Under Friedman's framework, it was always the money supply, and he is widely quoted as saying, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. This meant inflation wasn't caused by greedy unions or corporates, nor was it caused by foreign oil-producing governments. The true culprits were central banks and the domestic or home government. Put simply, it was printing money too fast that was the problem. Friedman's historical studies were also highly relevant. In collaboration with Anna Schwartz, Friedman wrote A Monetary History of the United States, 1867 to 1960. Up until then, most people thought the Great Depression was caused by the failings of capitalism, or by falling demand, or by the stock market crash. Friedman disagreed. He showed that the real problem was a catastrophic failure by the Federal Reserve. As banks collapsed and people pulled money out of the system, the money supply shrank, but the Fed did almost nothing to stop it. The monetary contraction during the early years of the Great Depression was the largest in US history, and one of the most severe in global economic history. Money supply shrank by 33%, bank credit fell by 40%, and 1/3 of banks failed. Prices fell, incomes collapsed, businesses folded, and there was a downward spiral. But according to Friedman, it didn't have to happen. If the Fed had stepped in, stabilized the money supply, and provided liquidity to solvent banks, the worst effects of the Great Depression could have been avoided. Fourthly, regarding stabilization policies, Keynesians believed that governments could smooth out the business cycle by spending in recessions and pulling back in booms, and central banks could adjust interest rates to fine-tune the economy. Friedman thought this was a terrible idea. He believed in rules-based policy, not discretion. His preferred rule: grow the money supply at a steady, predictable rate, say 3% per year, and leave it at that. Why? Because the economy is like a big ship. By the time you turn the wheel, it's already too late. There are lags in data, in decision-making, in implementation, and that leads to a dangerous game of overcorrecting, slamming the brakes when you should be accelerating and vice versa. He wasn't against all policy, but he was against bad, unpredictable policy, which in his view was most of it. Now, putting these theories into practice, this is where things got tricky. When politicians tried to implement Friedman's ideas, they hit some real-world roadblocks. Take the money supply. Friedman said, "Control the money supply and you control inflation." So governments like Thatcher's tried it. They picked a target, well actually a range, M3 growth of 6 to 10%, and told the Bank of England to stick to it. Problem was, it didn't work. Why? Because central banks don't control the money supply directly. Commercial banks create money through lending, and that can vary wildly. Credit expands in booms and contracts in busts. It's pro-cyclical and often unpredictable. Now, I have already posted a video on how commercial banks create money, so I won't say too much about it here, but a link will be provided at the end for those who are interested. Back to the story. So Thatcher's money supply targets were missed again and again. As a result, in 1985, they had to abandon the whole framework and shift to targeting interest rates and inflation instead. But even though the tools changed, the goal remained very much in the spirit of the Friedman philosophy: price stability, predictability, and rules over discretion. So what is left of Friedman's legacy today? Well, quite a lot, actually. Central banks today may not target the money supply, but they are deeply influenced by Friedman's core ideas: independent central banks, clear inflation targets, predictable and transparent policy, and a focus on long-term credibility. Think of the Fed, the European Central Bank, or the Bank of England. All of them have price stability as a primary objective. They try to stabilize inflation expectations, communicate clearly, and set rules and forward guidance. All of that is straight from Friedman's playbook. Ironically, Keynes himself would probably have approved. Contrary to what some believe, Keynes believed in the market economy and fiscal prudence. He supported intervention, but only when needed. And crucially, he believed governments should pull back once the crisis passed. I doubt he would have been a supporter of the constant meddling carried out in the 1960s and 70s. So, what do we have today? A blend of both. Governments and central banks still need to step in from time to time, but in a predictable way. Finally, in conclusion, Milton Friedman's Nobel Prize wasn't just an academic honor. It marked the beginning of a new era in economic thinking. His theories reshaped how we think about money, inflation, and the limits of government control. True, not all of the resulting policies worked as intended. Some failed in practice. Others had to be adapted. But his legacy has endured. His core message, that inflation is caused by too much money, that policy should be predictable, and that free markets generally outperform central planning, still holds, and has changed the economic conversation that has taken place ever since. A link for the next video and for the Nobel Prize in Economics playlist should be on your screens now. Just click to keep watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please like, subscribe, and comment. Thanks for watching.